Hello, my name is John Richter. I'm one of the modeling instructors here at Financial Mechanics, and I wanted to take a few minutes here to talk about what I've titled here Structured Scenario Selection, which, as the subtext indicates, I think takes a combination of strong input structure, the power and simplicity of the index function, the match function, which you may not yet be familiar with, and we'll introduce that if you're not, and a position or a time in which I think data validation actually is a good idea. Generally not an Excel feature that we are generally supportive of in fast modeling, but in this particular case I think data validation has its strength, and we'll take a look at what I'm talking about, and perhaps a controversial position dissing the data validation feature so heavily, but here is one element of it that I think is a good idea. So as with quite a few of our video tutorials, here's one where I don't think PowerPoint is going to get the job done, and we might as well hop straight into a model and see what we can do. So here we are with a classic constant or column-wise input sheet with an array in a very linear setups layout of constant inputs. And as you would expect, a few inputs which are series oriented, our widget price in real terms, a scenario selected debt repayment profile for this particular model using the index function, as you guys can see there, and you will have been introduced to that as part of your introduction to the index function. And crucially, what that leads to then is driving that scenario or the repayment scenario from a constant input, in this case a profile selection switch, which as you would expect is located on the constant or input C sheet there down in the term debt section. So from this position you might understand that we have the entire model essentially being driven from column F as far as its brains. It's kind of the package of inputs that are driving it, all structured up here in a single column on the input C sheet, and certainly that's the ultimate prospect for things at this stage of the game. And from this position what we're going to do is unhide our columns out there to the right, and what we're going to do is replicate this particular active column out here for a few other scenarios. Why don't I go ahead and do 4 of them? And what I've done is just pasted that. So all of those 4 columns, J through M, are replicas of the current base scenario, if you prefer. And what we'll do is start things off. We need to get some definition to what we're talking about. So I suppose we'd go for a scenario label. And I'll be simple. I'll just sort of say base. This will be sort of effectively a set of inputs: downside, I don't know, upside, and crater. How's that for an idea? And you'd expect and want to see those listed up here in the header. Looks like we've got right justification, which I've just reset in order to make that look a little bit better. And what you might argue here is going to be whatever we decide to pick for the current case. And so what I'll do right now is just say we're going to run with downside. And the only difference I'm going to make between these cases, let's say, is something simple. Why don't we run with something on the commercial side of things with widget price or volume production. Here's our annual production. Base is 400,000, downside might be 450,000, just so we have a little bit of definition. Upside we might do a little bit better with 520,000 per annum production, and crater is at 400,000. Some sort of disaster with our equipment. And you guys are going to say, well, how do we pick effectively these numbers? And you guys will know that we can use the index function to essentially go horizontally here, and we're going to drive that with a I don't know, scenario selection number +1. I'm going to confuse you guys here a little bit. I'm going to say the downside, and we'll be getting back to this fellow. Matter of fact, I'll use my techniques, mark this as a placeholder. I'm going to say the downside is number 3 because I'm going to start in column I. And so what that leads us to is an index function, index, where I pick from I, as I was just indicating, and possibly stretch it to n. We're going to talk more about that in a second. There's no harm in that, generally a good idea. And up, and I'm going to uncharacteristically row anchor that component, and we'll see why here in a second. But the idea is that that is no longer an input. That is a formula driven by that index function off that single number up at the top, picking, as we'd hoped, the downside as number 3. And this won't look too pretty, but in broad terms, I can copy that formula, and I'll do a paste special formula just to kind of retain my number formats and things like that throughout this this column of structured inputs. And of course, all these intermediate hyphens and stuff like that you'd want to kind of get rid of, and ultimately none of these are going to be inputs. So let me just get rid of any confusion here. And the point I'm making here is that that formula is sort of structurally copies through the column. So I'm just trying to indicate that you actually can set these fellows up, these structured input sheets for scenario selection, pretty quickly. And the idea is, if you think about the upside scenario being 520, if we change this number here to 4, and I come on back down here and I look at this number with a refresh, Shift F9, in goes the 520, and then from there, of course, you guys know that that drives the rest of the sheet. And I'm just kind of cleaning up a few of my neighboring hyphens to clean the sheet up a little bit. Now, from this position, you then say, well, John, that's all well and good, but that's not a very user-friendly interface to kind of tell people that you better make sure you add one and all this kind of thing. And God knows why did you even start the range from I. And so what we're going to use next is the opposite, the inverse essentially of the index function, which is the match function. And match essentially turns index inside out and allows you to look for a particular value. In this case, we're going to try to find that downside label in the range where we're going to be consistent with what we did with the index and pick that range across. And crucially, you guys will be introduced to the concept of the false parameter already from your VLOOKUP training potentially. An exact match requirement on that. Okay, I won't dwell on that just now. And that is a quick use of the match function, which now generates the number, that integer, properly. So I'll take off my placeholder marking on that fellow. And if I were to type in a different label here and do a Shift F9, we get 4. And then, of course, that 4 is driving all of these column F parameters. So that then just gets us to a position that says, well, gosh, John, if somebody, mistypes, it's going to be a train wreck. You're going to, get precisely the text and everything like that in there. And of course, at one level, that's encouraging to have that kind of mess up if you don't get the right scenario. But we ought to do something a little bit better than that. One of the things you can do, of course, is to tell people just to kind of pick the scenario. So if I went over and picked creator just by pointing at it and did a Shift F9, I'd get the 5, and then we'd carry on from there. But that's not ultimately as user-friendly or compelling from kind of a cockpit or a dashboard perspective as using data validation. And for once in Excel 2007, you guys will be amused to know that yours truly is actually going to find this feature within the 2007 interface. Under 03, it's on the data menu, data validation, and in fact in 07, Alt-A for the data section of your ribbon validation over here, V. So Alt-AV and data validation, either enter or another V, and of course you get your classic 2003 dialog looking box, and that's where data validation is located. So with that by way of preamble, Alt-AV, enter on our cell that we actually want to kind of restrict to data validation. And what we're going to do is pick from a list. Data validation list, I think, is one of, as I was sort of indicating in my preamble, perhaps the only kind of solid way to use data validation. And what we're going to do is be consistent again with that range. It's still a mystery to you guys on this video as to what I'm up to there, but we're going to pick I through N, and you guys can work on it from there. There's other things you can pick, alerts and all sorts of stuff. I'm just going to kind of leave the defaults in place and not make too much of a meal of this, just to sort of demonstrate the point. And what we get is a drop-down list, which an untrained user will kind of enjoy the idea that they can see that drop-down arrow and pick from the list. And when we pick upside and do a Shift F9, we get a 4, and we of course drive the index function instances from that position. As a trained modeler, you guys are going to hold down the Alt key with the down arrow. One of the few times you hold the Alt key down with the next key sequence and simply pick off the list. Here I'll go back to base, Shift F9, we'd expect to see that 2 there, and everything drives from there. And that's where I'm going to leave it on this video, just scratching the surface, trying to set up a structured input sheet. And before I go, what I'm going to do is show what we're up to with these columns that I'm going to kind of give a heavy gray marking to for a second. To, maybe 4 wide, if that, maybe 2 wide is better. Probably hide out the rest. What the idea here of those stretch columns that I've marked gray on either side, those are kind of included in the ranges, but not part of, so if I just remind ourselves what we have here with these index functions, we're including that as part of the index. We also included it in the data validation list, and we included it with the match function, is that we now have the ability to drop a new scenario in place. So for instance, if you wanted to replicate the upside scenario and make that maybe the most recent and important scenario over here on the left, you could take a copy of that upside column that has all the assumptions associated with the upside case, put yourself here, do a Shift Control plus as you would, call this upside 2 or something like that, and you very quickly now have a new column. You'll see the base case is now kind of pushed to position 3. It's been pushed down off of pole position, and you have a new upside 2 case where you want it, where upside 2 might have an even higher production or some such thing. And what you'll see is that by including that in the data validation, we also now have it on the list, and there's upside 2 that we can simply run with an Alt down arrow, pick it off the list, Shift F9, there you get the 2, and you run with your new 550,000 units per year of widget production. And that, I think, covers things for this initial introduction to structured input sheets. And with that, I suppose I'd wrap up by just listing what I feel are the key points. First off, it is pretty clear that the basic underpinnings necessary for this relied on a structured input layout. This can get more complicated. You've got other things that start to emerge with models, including being able to drive your inputs from what I'd called here polished dashboards, nice, presentable, user-friendly, printable assumption sheets, and also setting up for sensitivity flexing is probably part of that, including driving things from data tables to get the kind of wide range of things. The index and match function were used in combination, although not nested together in this particular example, but the kind of yin and yang of the index and match I think were used to good effect in this particular example. Good use of data validation. So as much as I like to slag off data validation as an Excel feature in general and dislike to see it employed too heavily in modeling in general, this is a good user control interface in this particular example. The structure that we set up, I think, is arguably very simple to set up. I managed to get that done pretty quickly. Easy to run. And ultimately that concept of including those stretch columns on either side of the scenarios, and of course you can throw one in the middle as well, allow us to simply add scenarios. So people that like to argue that the choose function is just as effective as the index are missing a very major component, that the choose function does not allow range argument, and the index, which does, allows that stretching capability. And no, the offset function is not an effective or the most efficient solution, in my opinion anyway, for this scenario selection option. And last but not least, no, the Excel Scenario Manager is pretty junky, in my opinion. Not a feature I think that Microsoft should be particularly proud of at all. I don't believe, although I haven't dug into it, I don't believe it's gotten really any better or any different with Excel 2007. I don't know about 2010 yet, but fundamentally most professional modelers do not generally find that Scenario Manager something you want to run with. And with that, I will say goodbye for today and hope you guys tune in to some subsequent videos. Talk to you later. Bye.